He can rewire a fuse box, negotiate a mortgage, and drive 400 miles without once checking a map. But he cannot manage to say the sentence, "I don't know how to do this." Ask him to name one thing he needed help with over the last year, and he will describe something he eventually solved, not something he actually requested. Offer him assistance directly, in a small and low-stakes moment, and watch his shoulders straighten before his mouth has even produced an answer. The refusal arrives faster than manners would require, faster than the real cost of accepting help would ever justify. Something decided this pattern for him decades before the question was first asked of him. Watch him for longer and the pattern does not resolve. It multiplies quietly across every domain of his life. He drives in circles for 20 minutes before admitting out loud that the route he chose was wrong. He waits nearly a year before mentioning chest tightness to a doctor who could have addressed it early. He rebuilds an engine alone at midnight rather than call the mechanic his own neighbor recommended to him. He tells his wife that he has it handled, in a tone that makes clear he does not have it handled at all. None of these moments look like crisis from the outside. They look like independence, competence, maybe stubbornness at worst, nothing more alarming than that. That surface reading is exactly what makes the underlying pattern so difficult to name correctly. It has been rebranded so many times by him and by everyone around him that it stopped registering as a pattern and started registering instead as simple personality. Personality, though, does not explain why the behavior repeats so uniformly across men who never met each other, who grew up in different towns, worked different trades, and would deny having anything meaningful in common with one another. It does not explain why the same reflex activates identically whether the stakes are trivial or genuinely severe, whether the offer of help comes from a stranger passing by or from a spouse of 30 years. A trait this consistent, appearing on schedule across an entire generation of men, cannot be dismissed as simple idiosyncrasy. This is architecture built with intention somewhere far earlier than adulthood, and architecture always has an origin worth locating. Go back far enough and the outline becomes visible in rooms that seemingly had nothing to do with mortgages or broken engines. Classrooms, ball fields, kitchen tables where report cards were read aloud without mercy. Boys of this generation were sorted early, constantly, and almost always in public view. Grades were posted for the entire class to see and silently rank themselves against. Teams were chosen in front of everyone, with the slowest selections landing like small public verdicts. Siblings were compared across the dinner table without anyone ever using the actual word comparison out loud. A father's attention, often scarce to begin with in that era, was allocated like a limited prize, and the fastest route to a share of it was proving convincingly that you required none of it. Need, when it appeared, was rarely met with warmth or curiosity from the adults around him. It was met instead with a flicker of quiet disappointment, subtle enough for the adult to deny later, clear enough for an 8-year-old to catalog and remember permanently. Somewhere inside that decade, a boy learned that needing something and losing something functioned for all practical purposes as the very same event. This dynamic was rarely deliberate cruelty inside most households of that era. It was closer to efficiency, a family and a wider culture calibrated for measurable output during years when attention, money, and affection all felt severely rationed. Competition was not an occasional feature of childhood during those years. It was the operating logic underneath nearly all of it, present quietly in almost every interaction that seemed to matter.
And a child raised entirely inside a single logic does not experience it as one option among several available choices. He experiences it instead as reality itself, as the water he does not yet know he is swimming through. Once that logic settles fully into a developing nervous system, it does not remain contained to the playground or the classroom where it originally took shape. It becomes a general theory of how safety and worth are obtained anywhere, and it begins quietly generating rules for every room he will ever walk into afterward. No single rule on its own can account for what this produces 4 decades later in an adult man's daily behavior. What produces it instead is several separate systems operating at once, stacked tightly and interlocking, each one compensating for a specific gap the others leave dangerously open. A behavioral reflex alone would likely have faded well before adulthood arrived. A private belief held in isolation would eventually have been challenged by enough contradicting evidence over time. What actually survives decades of contradicting evidence is a full structure, not merely a single idea. And a structure this durable always operates on more than one level simultaneously and continuously. 7 layers together make up that structure: the visible surface behavior, the habit sitting beneath that behavior, the identity fused to that habit, the responsibility attached tightly to that identity, the relationships reshaped by that responsibility, the meaning eventually drawn from those altered relationships, and beneath every one of those 6, a blind spot shared by an entire generation of men who never once compared notes with each other. Begin with what is visible on the surface, because everything underneath it was quietly built to protect exactly that surface. The visible layer is simple enough to catalog directly once someone actually stops to look for it. He avoids asking strangers for directions, even when clearly lost. He minimizes physical symptoms when describing them to physicians, understating pain almost automatically. He resists delegating tasks at work, even when delegation would be measurably faster and more efficient for everyone involved. He deflects genuine offers of help with a joke, a quick change of subject, or a flat statement that he is fine. Underneath each single instance sits an identical private calculation, rarely conscious yet remarkably consistent across situations. A request for help functions as a public admission that competence has run out, and competence running out was, in childhood, treated reliably as evidence of failure rather than as neutral information. So the behavior in front of you is not really about the fuse box or the doctor's appointment or the delegated task at all. It is a small, repeated act of self-protection against an old verdict that was handed down once and never formally appealed since. Each refusal briefly closes the gap between how competent he needs to appear and how competent he privately fears he actually is underneath. That relief is entirely real in the moment, and it is also precisely the mechanism guaranteeing the behavior will repeat again soon. Because the underlying fear itself was never addressed, only avoided one additional time. Repetition is the exact point where a single behavior stops being a conscious choice and starts becoming an automatic habit instead. And this is where the entire pattern slips below deliberate control. Every time he solved a problem alone rather than asking someone nearby for help, his nervous system quietly logged a small success: threat avoided, standing preserved, status intact for another day. Over enough repeated years, that logging accumulates steadily into full automaticity. He is no longer actively deciding not to ask for help in most moments. The option barely surfaces at all as a genuine possibility anymore. Neurologically and behaviorally, self-reliance has become his default pathway, in much the same way a daily commute becomes automatic after 10 straight years of driving it without conscious thought. The habit is efficient, and that efficiency is exactly why it remains so dangerous over time. Efficiency means it costs him almost nothing noticeable in any single moment, so there is rarely an obvious occasion to question the pattern directly. What quietly accumulates instead is a steady narrowing. Fewer situations each year get processed through genuine collaboration. More and more get processed through solitary endurance instead, until an entire adult life is running on a track laid down long before he ever turned 12. A habit that consistent, sustained for that many decades, eventually stops being something a man merely does. It becomes very close to something a man simply is. That merging marks the third layer, the point where habit fully calcifies into identity itself. Ask him directly who he is, and the answer will lean heavily on function rather than on feeling.
Provider, fixer, the reliable one people call whenever something around them breaks down. This leaning is not vanity in any meaningful sense. It is closer to a survival architecture, because if identity itself is built around being the person who handles everything, then any single occasion of not handling something threatens the identity directly, not merely the practical outcome of that one task. This is precisely the point where asking for help stops being merely uncomfortable for him and becomes something closer to structurally impossible. Because the request is not experienced as a request at all, it is experienced as a small act of self-erasure. He cannot easily tell the difference anymore between wanting not to ask this time and simply not being the kind of man who asks. For him, internally, those two statements collapsed long ago into a single sentence. Identity fused this tightly to function remains remarkably stable under ordinary daily conditions. It is also remarkably brittle under real pressure, precisely because there is no separate fallback self standing behind the competent one he presents to the world. Once identity is constructed on top of function, responsibility itself stops behaving like a role he occupies temporarily and starts behaving instead like the very ground he permanently stands on. He does not experience responsibility the way someone might experience a job title, something held loosely and comfortably set down again at the end of each working day. He experiences it instead as continuous and unbroken, a fixed condition rather than a finite list of tasks. Because letting go of any single piece of it would mean letting go of a piece of himself along with it. This is exactly why he keeps carrying obligations that have long since stopped genuinely requiring his personal involvement. Delegation feels less like sensible management to him and more like a quiet abdication of self. The pressure that steadily builds from this arrangement is largely invisible from the outside, because outwardly it resembles diligence, resembles commitment, resembles the very reliability everyone around him openly praises him for demonstrating. Internally, though, it functions closer to a debt that can genuinely never be paid down in full, only serviced indefinitely. Month after month, without anyone around him ever being told what the actual balance has quietly become. Responsibility carried in this particular way inevitably reorganizes every relationship surrounding him, because a man who cannot ever set down what he is holding cannot truly be met halfway by anyone standing close beside him. His partner learns slowly, without ever being told this directly in words, that genuine offers of help will reliably be declined, so eventually those offers simply stop coming altogether. And this shift gets quietly misread by both of them as respect for his independence, rather than as accumulated resignation on her part. His children learn early which problems get brought openly to him and which get quietly solved somewhere else instead, because his responses to any visible vulnerability, however unintentional on his part, taught them the unwritten rules years ago. Friendships gradually flatten into logistics and shared activity, because real depth requires a kind of mutual exposure he has spent 40 years carefully training himself out of tolerating. None of this looks like isolation when viewed from any reasonable distance. It looks instead like a full calendar, a stable marriage, and a wide circle of acquaintances who each would describe him as remarkably solid and dependable. Isolation of this particular kind rarely announces itself directly. It simply removes one small avoidance at a time, the specific kind of contact where someone might have actually seen him struggling and chosen to stay anyway. Given enough accumulated decades inside this exact structure, meaning itself eventually gets reshaped entirely around it. What he privately counts as a life well lived tends to center on what he personally endured without assistance, rather than on what he ever meaningfully shared with another person. The mortgage paid off entirely alone, the small business kept afloat through the genuinely hard years, the family provided for without ever once, by his own private account, needing to lean on anyone nearby. These become the actual measures by which he quietly assesses whether his life amounted to something worthwhile. Connection, when it appears anywhere in this private accounting at all, appears strictly as a secondary good, pleasant enough but never truly load-bearing, while self-sufficiency alone occupies the central position that intimacy might otherwise have held for someone else. This is not because he values other people any less than other men might. It is because the entire system was carefully built, layer by layer since early childhood, to make quiet endurance feel like the safer and far more legitimate source of personal worth. Meaning constructed this particular way proves durable across a lifetime, and it is also strangely lonely at its core, because it was never actually designed to include any witnesses at all.
Here, the investigation stops being about any single man at all, because this exact configuration is not rare, not regional, and not simply a matter of individual temperament or upbringing alone. It runs consistently through an entire generation of men who grew up inside the same competitive scarcity, the same rationed parental approval, the same quiet equation of expressed need with visible weakness, absorbed at nearly identical ages inside nearly identical households that never once coordinated deliberately with one another. No single parent designed this outcome on purpose or with any conscious intention. No formal institution ever issued explicit instructions for producing it reliably at scale. It assembled itself gradually out of economic conditions, everyday sorting rituals, and inherited models of manhood that were themselves passed down from fathers who learned an identical lesson from their own fathers before them. Each successive generation certain it was raising sons somewhat differently, while quietly reproducing the exact same architecture underneath the surface. The men living inside this structure today largely cannot see it clearly, not because they personally lack insight or self-awareness, but because the structure itself was built specifically to remain invisible from inside it, disguised the entire time as simple, ordinary strength. None of these 7 layers functions as an isolated cause operating entirely on its own. The visible avoidance exists precisely because the habit sitting beneath it has become fully automatic over time. The habit is automatic because it fused tightly with identity many decades ago. Identity holds its shape because responsibility genuinely has nowhere else left to attach itself within him. Responsibility, in turn, distorts every relationship that gets quietly built around it over the years. Those altered relationships eventually produce a definition of meaning centered on endurance rather than on any real exposure to others. And that particular definition of meaning is shared, largely unrecognized, across an entire generation of men raised under nearly identical conditions decades ago. Each layer requires the one directly above it to remain stable and intact. Each layer supplies exactly the pressure that keeps the layer below it firmly in place. Remove any single layer from this arrangement, and the others do not simply collapse outward, they quietly reorganize themselves around whatever gap was left open. Because the entire system was never actually about one isolated behavior. It was always, from the very beginning, about maintaining one complete and interlocking arrangement. The man at the center of all this did not personally choose the arrangement he now lives inside, and he is not being asked here to abandon it or replace it with something else. He is not the subject of any verdict being handed down in this analysis. He is simply an instance of a wider pattern, one particular version of a structure that could just as easily be described using a different name, a different decade of birth, or a different household entirely. What becomes visible once these 7 layers are carefully traced from the surface all the way down to the root is that something long assumed to be personal character was, the entire time, a structure that was inherited, steadily reinforced, and quietly passed forward without any single generation ever choosing it on purpose. Nothing here reaches a final conclusion in the usual sense. The investigation simply arrives at the exact point where the full shape can finally be seen clearly, and it stops there because seeing that shape was the only claim being made from the start. A related question sits just beneath this one, largely unexamined by anyone so far. Why the same men who cannot ask for help themselves are frequently the very ones others turn to for guidance, mentoring younger colleagues freely, coaching their own children's teams without hesitation, advising friends through personal crises with genuine patience, all while remaining perfectly fluent in giving support and functionally illiterate in ever receiving it themselves. That particular asymmetry deserves its own separate investigation, not this one here. Thank you for following this entire investigation all the way through to its end. If one of these 7 layers felt noticeably more familiar than the others while reading, that specific recognition is worth sitting with quietly rather than explaining away too quickly. For anyone inclined to keep watching structures like this one get traced out carefully, layer by layer, subscribing and turning on notifications will bring the next investigation directly to you when it is ready.